My presentation today is going to be on Milton Friedman and his effect on society. So in my presentation, we're going to talk about 5 areas. We're going to cover a little bit about the traditional role of capitalism. We're going to give some background on what the view of the Chicago School of Economics was. We're going to talk in detail about the 1970 Milton Friedman article that made such a change in our society. We're going to discuss Friedman's view of capitalism, and then very briefly go over the pros and cons of what's happened. Now, I joked with my wife when I started this class to say that I am actually a primary source in this class because I remember this area. My first boss was a gentleman by the name shown here, John Pillsbury, and he talked to the employees of Northwestern National Life. He talked about society as a 3-legged stool. You have shareholders, you have employees, and you have the public. And he adamantly believed that you had to be fair to each group. If you're not fair to each group, then one leg is cut short and the stool tips over. So, stock company, make money. Employees, be fair to them. Public, you have public responsibilities. And this was a very common attitude amongst and it was gentlemen, by the way, who had fought in World War II and were now running the companies in the 60s and 70s. This was their firm belief. Now, what effect did that have on society? Well, you had lifelong employment at one employer. The employer provided the training, and the training was from in-house training department. The employer supported the community. There were annual social events for the entire plant. You were social, you got to know people. Medical care was provided, and in fact, the first job I had, there was actually a doctor and nurse in the office building. Expectation was everybody had a nice vacation every year, and the employer provided your pension. Now, by way of background, Milton Friedman came out of what was known as the Chicago School of Economics, and they firmly believed in the infallibility of the marketplace, that government was inefficient, its role should be minimized, and this all came out of a book by a gentleman named Friedrich von Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. He made the argument that if you have socialism, socialism will lead to totalitarianism. Well, let's hear Mr. von Hayek actually speak about that.
Improved only by the idea that we are going to do it in the service of some idea of social justice, but that they would be bound to use the same compulsory methods, essentially restricting and diminishing individual freedom, always in the service of a very good purpose, of course, not in the service of a particular group. But that basically there was no difference between socialism and fascism.
So in the 1970 New York Times Sunday magazine, Milton Friedman wrote this article, and it was used by many, many baby boomers to justify major changes in our society. So let's take a look at what this was all about. Now here's the concluding line of his article. There is one and only one responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. Earlier in the article it says, any other thing is socialism. So here's my understanding of Friedman's key points. Is that he argued that a corporate executive is the employee of the shareholder. And therefore, as an employee, it's not appropriate for an employee to spend the shareholder's money for social purposes. If the employee wants to contribute to charity on his own, that's just fine. Or if the shareholder says, well, this is a hospital or a school, and so we have a social purpose for the organization, that's fine. But if it's a corporation, his argument is corporations are there to make money for the shareholders. And as executive, you're an employee of the shareholder. You're supposed to be doing things for their interest, not for somebody else's. Because then he argues that if you do anything other than make money for the shareholders, you're just engaging in socialism. So where did Friedman come up with this idea? Well, it originates back in a book that he wrote in 1962 called Capitalism and Freedom. Let's read a couple key passages that pretty much say exactly what he said in 1970. From the introduction to the book, where it says he's talking about the book itself. Its major theme is the role of competitive capitalism the organization of the bulk of economic activity through private enterprise operating in a free market as a system of economic freedom and a necessary condition for political freedom. Its minor theme is the role that government should play in a society dedicated to freedom and relying primarily on the market to organize economic activity. And he goes on to say the government should play a very secondary role. Later in the book, he picks up on a theme that became the heart of his 1970 article. It says, the view has been gaining. Corporate officials and labor leaders have a social responsibility that goes beyond serving the interests of their stockholders or their members. This view shows a fundamental misconception of the character and nature of a free economy. In such an economy, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use the resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free enterprise without deception or fraud. So let's listen to Mr. Friedman make his own arguments that are in favor of the free market.
The argument for collectivism, for government doing something, is simple. Anybody can understand it. If there's something wrong, pass a law. If somebody is in trouble, get Mr. X to help him out. The argument for voluntary cooperation for a free market is not nearly so simple. It says, you know, if you allow people to cooperate voluntarily and don't interfere with them, indirectly through the operation of the market, they will improve matters more than you can improve it directly by appointing somebody. That's a subtle argument, and it's hard for people to understand.
Okay, let's briefly discuss some of the pros and cons of what happens since or because he wrote that article. Let's focus on three major cons. After that article was adopted, it was the end of paternalism. Shareholders count, nothing else counts. And so the country clubs and the parties and the job security, which is the next thing, stopped. Now the average time somebody spends on a job is like 5 years. Before, the expectation was you work 30 or 40 years somewhere. No longer. All those in-house training jobs, gone. What would you focus on your area of expertise? Everything else is shipped out and outsourced. Was re-engineering and outsourcing became the big terms. It was also really the beginning of income disparity because, and here again, it was typically men take over these countries and say, we're going to do whatever it takes to make the shareholders rich. And when we make the shareholders rich, you're going to make us rich too. And so the executive pay as a ratio to average pay, it's just totally out of control. So in 1965, the average ratio of CEO earnings to worker compensation was 20.2 to 1. 2015, 270.5 to 1. Yeah, I'd say that's a little out of control. Now, the changes are not all bad. We are a much more efficient economy than we were in 1970. Northwestern National Life, John Pillsbury was a wonderful man, but that was not a very well-run company. When you think about the automobiles that were made in the 70s, like the Pinto, which I owned one, they were horrible automobiles. And so we've gotten much more efficient. We've invented the internet and the PCs and cell phones. And so we are a much more efficient economy. And because we're a more efficient economy, we are a much more profitable economy. So this is a graph of what your savings account would do if you had invested in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And you can see that during the 70s and 80s, it was not increasing all that much, but as these effects that took, the increases in productivity that came about because of this focus on profits, we really did make a lot more money. A big drop here in 2008 because didn't work out well there, but it's taken off again. And so there were years I made more money on the increase in my 401k than my salary. I'm just about out of time, so I'll end. I look forward to your questions.